25 minutes after I delivered my daughter, my husband stared down at her tiny wrinkled face and said, "I want a paternity test." At first, I genuinely believed I had misheard him. The room still reeked of antiseptic and sweat. My entire body felt scraped hollow. I was trembling from exhaustion while a nurse adjusted the blood pressure cuff that squeezed my arm every few minutes. Beyond the hospital window, the Toledo skyline looked smeared and colorless under a freezing January downpour. And there stood Brandon beside the bassinet, arms folded across his chest like a man reviewing a contract instead of gazing at his newborn daughter. "This baby might not be mine," he said. I stared at him. Not angry yet. Just bewildered. My brain felt sluggish and waterlogged after 21 hours of labor. I remember blinking up at the fluorescent panels overhead, trying to arrange his words into something coherent while our daughter made these small squeaking sounds beside the bed. The nurse froze. Not entirely. She kept moving but slower now. Pause. Like someone crossing a frozen pond. "Brandon," I whispered. "What are you talking about?" He scratched the back of his neck. "You were away in Milwaukee for that conference." I actually laughed once. Not because anything was funny but because my mind refused to accept the situation at all. "You mean the school counselor conference?" I asked. "You were there 4 nights. I called you every single night." "That doesn't prove anything." The words hit harder than I anticipated. I glanced over at my mother-in-law, Rosalind, seated near the window in one of those rigid hospital chairs with a foam cup of coffee cradled in her hands. She wasn't shocked. That was the first thing I registered. She looked terrified. Not surprised, not angry at him. Terrified. Her fingers squeezed the coffee cup so hard the lid buckled inward. "Brandon," she said quietly, "maybe this isn't the moment." But he pressed forward. "I'm just saying the timing doesn't sit right with me." I remember looking down at Nora then. She was swaddled in that striped hospital blanket with her little fist tucked against her cheek. 10 fingers, a tiny nose, thick dark hair already sticking straight up. And somehow my husband was treating her like an exhibit in a courtroom. A nurse named Delphine finally cleared her throat. She looked about 60, gray curls tucked beneath her scrub cap, reading glasses dangling from a chain around her neck. "Sir," she said carefully, "your wife delivered a baby less than an hour ago." Brandon shrugged. "I'm not accusing anyone. I'm asking for certainty. I wish I could tell you I detonated. I didn't. That's the peculiar thing about humiliation. Sometimes it doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it comes quietly, piece by piece, until suddenly you can't draw a full breath." I looked at Brandon. Really looked at him. The man I had been married to for 12 years. The man who held my hand through 2 miscarriages. The man who wept in an Applebee's parking lot 4 years earlier after another failed round of fertility treatment. And now here he stood, studying me like some stranger he barely trusted. My stomach turned over. "You think I cheated on you?" I asked. He didn't answer directly. "That conference fell right around the conception window." Conception window. He said it like a man reading aloud from a medical chart. Something inside me went cold. Rosalind stood up abruptly. "Brandon, that's enough." But he ignored her too. I deserved to know the truth. That sentence did it. Not the accusation. Not the timing. The arrogance. As though he were the injured party in that room. I slowly reached for my phone on the tray table beside the bed. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped it. Brandon frowned. "Who are you calling?" I unlocked the screen and scrolled through my contacts. "Renee," Rosalind whispered, panic climbing into her voice. "Please don't make enormous decisions tonight." I looked directly at her. "Funny," I said softly. "Nobody warned your son about that 25 minutes ago." Then I pressed call. Yvette Barros answered on the 3rd ring. "Renee." Yvette had been my closest friend since college. She lived in Columbus now and practiced family law. Sharp as a scalpel, divorced twice herself and unapologetically proud of surviving both. I swallowed hard. "Yvette," I said, my voice fracturing, "I need you to prepare divorce papers." The room went absolutely silent. Brandon actually laughed. Not loudly. Just one short, disbelieving exhale. "Oh, come on," he said. "You're being dramatic." That word struck harder than the accusation itself. Dramatic. I had spent 21 hours in labor. I still had an 4 taped to my arm. I could barely sit upright without pain shooting through my abdomen. And somehow I was the dramatic one. Yvette's voice sharpened instantly through the phone. What happened? I kept my eyes locked on Brandon. My husband demanded a paternity test half an hour after our daughter was born. There was a pause. Then Yvette said very calmly, I'll drive up tomorrow morning. Brandon rolled his eyes and walked toward the window. This is absurd. Rosalind looked like she might faint. She sank back into the chair slowly and pressed her fingertips against her forehead. Renee, she whispered, please wait for the results before you start digging into things. Digging. That word lodged itself in my mind. Not fighting. Not leaving. Digging. I noticed Delphine catching it too. The nurse quietly adjusted Nora's blanket before leaning closer to me. In a voice pitched low enough that only I could hear, she said, Sweetheart, pay attention to how a person behaves when you're at your most vulnerable. That usually tells you everything you need to know. Then she squeezed my shoulder and slipped out of the room. Rain tapped steadily against the hospital window. Brandon stood with his back to me, scrolling through his phone as though none of this were unusual. Rosalind kept staring at the floor tiles. And I sat there in that hospital bed holding my newborn daughter, realizing I suddenly didn't recognize the man I had married. But worse than that, I had the sickening feeling his mother knew something I didn't. Around 3 a.m, they wheeled me down the hallway toward recovery. The corridors were hushed except for distant monitor beeps and the squeak of rubber wheels against tile. Rosalind walked beside my bed, clutching her purse against her chest. Right before the nurse pushed me into the recovery room, Rosalind bent down close to me. Her voice trembled. Renee, she whispered, please don't go looking for things you can't undo. Then she stepped back immediately like she regretted saying it. I stared at her while the nurse rolled me inside. And for the first time that night I stopped thinking about the paternity test. Because suddenly I was wondering what exactly Rosalind was so frightened I might uncover. 3 days after Nora was born, I brought her home to our house in Sylvania during the ugliest freezing rain northern Ohio had seen all winter. The neighborhood looked gray and worn out. Bare trees, slush-caked sidewalks, filthy snow banked near the mailboxes. Someone across the street still had half their Christmas lights sagging from the gutters even though it was mid-January. Brandon carried the car seat inside without saying much. Not rude but not warm either. Just distant. Like a man awaiting results from a mechanic. I remember standing in our kitchen while the garage door rattled shut behind him. The dishwasher hummed softly. Somebody on our street was running a snowblower even though there wasn't nearly enough snow left to justify it. Normal sounds. Normal life. But everything inside me felt tilted off its axis. A casserole from our neighbor Charlene sat on the counter wrapped in foil beside a warehouse-sized pack of newborn diapers. Somebody from church had left carnations near the sink. Congratulations balloons still bobbed near the dining room table. And somehow my marriage already felt like a corpse. Nora started crying around 6 that evening while I was attempting to figure out breastfeeding for the 100th time. Nobody warns you how exhausting it is at first. Your entire life becomes measured in ounces, burping, and whether another human being has recently produced a bowel movement. I sat in the nursery glider half-conscious while Nora fussed against my chest. Brandon appeared in the doorway. We should probably schedule the test this week, he said. I looked up slowly. Not because I hadn't heard him, but because I genuinely couldn't believe he was raising it again while I was leaking breast milk through an old university t-shirt and running on maybe 90 minutes of sleep. You honestly think I cheated on you? He sighed theatrically as though I were the one making things difficult. I think we need clarity. There is clarity. You don't know that. I laughed quietly to myself. Not happy laughter. The kind people produce when they realize a conversation has departed reality entirely. Brandon folded his arms. Look, once everything comes back we can move forward. Move forward. Like I was some temporary malfunction he intended to resolve. I looked down at Nora sleeping against me and suddenly felt something strange. Not heartbreak anymore. Distance. Like I was already beginning to emotionally step away from him. That first week home was miserable. Not because of the baby. Because of the atmosphere. Brandon started sleeping in the guest room temporarily. He claimed Nora's crying kept him awake for work, but I knew better. He wanted distance from me while he waited on his precious lab results. And somehow, without ever directly accusing me publicly, he managed to seed suspicion everywhere. My phone began buzzing with peculiar messages. Thinking of your family during this stressful season. Marriages go through difficult stretches. Praying for wisdom and healing. Nobody outright asked whether I had cheated. They didn't need to. Brandon had already planted the seed. One afternoon while Nora slept in her swing beside the couch, I overheard Brandon talking quietly in the kitchen. "I'm just being cautious," he told someone on the phone. "Men get trapped all the time." I closed my eyes. Trapped. That word sat in my chest like battery acid. 2 miscarriages, 3 rounds of fertility treatment, thousands of dollars in medical bills, years of heartbreak. And now I was apparently trapping him. Rosalind came over nearly every day, always carrying something. Baby blankets, frozen soup, tiny socks. She moved around the house anxiously, cleaning things that required no cleaning. One afternoon she reorganized my spice cabinet for absolutely no reason. That's when I understood how frightened she was. Rosalind only cleaned when she was upset. "Sweetheart," she said while wiping an already spotless countertop, "men get scared after babies arrive." I stared at her. "Do they usually accuse their wives of adultery in the maternity ward?" She flinched. "A child changes everything. So does humiliation." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I noticed she had stopped defending Brandon directly. Instead she kept circling back to family, stability, forgiveness. Like she was trying to hold a collapsing wall upright with her bare hands. Around the second week, exhaustion truly arrived. Not movie exhaustion. Real exhaustion. The kind where you weep because you dropped a spoon. I hadn't properly washed my hair in 5 days. My stitches still burned every time I stood up too quickly. Nora wanted to feed constantly, and every room in the house smelled faintly of formula, laundry detergent, and cold coffee. One evening Brandon came home carrying flowers from the grocery store. Yellow carnations, the cheap kind stacked near the checkout lanes. "I thought we could try having a nice night," he said. I nearly laughed at the sheer absurdity. 3 hours earlier he had texted asking whether I would sign the consent paperwork for the testing lab. Now he was buying discount flowers like we were patching up a minor disagreement about groceries. He sat beside me on the couch while sports highlights played quietly in the background. Nora slept in my lap. "You know," he said carefully, "if everything comes back fine we can put all this behind us." I turned slowly toward him. "If." He rubbed his face. "Renee, stop twisting my words." "No," I said softly. "You already twisted enough of them." He stood up immediately, irritated. "This is precisely what I mean. Everything becomes drama with you lately." There was again. Drama. Emotional. Unstable. Those slow little linguistic tricks that make women question their own reactions. I stood too quickly, trying to transfer Nora into her bassinet, and nearly lost my balance. A bottle attached to my breast pump tipped sideways and spilled directly across Brandon's open laptop sitting on the coffee table. "Oh, for God's sake," he snapped. He grabbed the computer instantly. "Not Nora. Not me. The computer. Do you have any idea what this thing cost?" I looked down at our sleeping daughter. Then back at him, panicking over electronics while his newborn lay 3 feet away. And something inside me hardened permanently. Later that night Rosalind came over unexpectedly carrying a bag of hand-me-down baby clothes. "Some things from church friends," she explained. I barely had the energy left to argue. Nora had finally fallen asleep around midnight, so I sat on the living room floor sorting tiny pajamas while Rosalind folded blankets nearby. That's when I found the card. It slid out from inside a little blue cardigan. The envelope was aged and creased at the corners. On the front, written in shaky cursive, "Happy 14th birthday, Julian. Love always, Grandma Roz." I froze. The room went very quiet. Rosalind spotted the card in my hand and moved faster than I had seen her move in weeks. "Oh," she said quickly, snatching it away. "That's nothing." I stared at her. "Who's Julian?" Her face changed instantly. Far too quickly. "A boy from church." I said nothing. Because people don't typically sign birthday cards to random boys from church's grandma. Rosalind shoved the card back into the bag. "You're overtired," she said. "You shouldn't be overthinking things right now." Then she left almost immediately. At 3:47 that morning I sat in the nursery feeding Nora beneath the dim yellow lamp beside the rocking chair. The house creaked softly around us. Sleet ticked against the windows. And I opened Facebook. Rosalind's page was mostly church potlucks, scripture verses, and blurry family photographs. But eventually I found it. An old comment from a woman named Tessa Vance in Fort Wayne. Julian still asks about his dad. Please tell Brandon to call him. I stared at the screen until my phone dimmed and went dark. Then I looked down at my daughter sleeping against my chest. And for the first time since the hospital, the paternity test stopped mattering entirely. Because suddenly I understood that Rosalind wasn't afraid I had cheated. She was afraid I would discover what her son had been concealing. I didn't confront Brandon right away. That surprised me. A younger version of myself would have marched straight into the kitchen brandishing screenshots and demanding explanations. But exhaustion changes you. Motherhood changes you faster. By the third week after Nora was born, I felt like I was living in 40-minute intervals. Feed the baby. Change the baby. Wash bottles. Cry briefly. Repeat. Meanwhile, Brandon moved through the house acting almost normal again, which somehow made everything worse. He kissed Nora's forehead before work every morning. Took out the recycling. Watched old detective reruns in the evenings like we were an ordinary suburban couple weathering a rough patch. Then every few days he would casually mention the test again. Like a reminder. Like a leash. I finally called Yvette late one night after Brandon went to bed. Nora had been screaming for nearly 2 hours straight with gas pains, and I was sitting on the laundry room floor because it was the only dark, quiet place left in the house. I found something, I whispered. Yvette listened silently while I described the birthday card, Tessa's comment and Rosalind's reaction. When I finished, there was a pause. Then Yvette asked, "Do you want the truth or do you want reassurance?" That sounds like a lawyer question. It is. I leaned my head against the dryer. I want to know whether my entire marriage was fiction. Yvette exhaled slowly. Then don't confront him yet. That was hard to hear. Every instinct in me demanded answers immediately. But Yvette explained something I didn't fully appreciate at the time. People who lie for years don't suddenly become honest when they're cornered. They just become more sophisticated. So instead of confronting Brandon, I started paying attention. Real attention. The kind you only begin giving once trust has died. I noticed he always stepped outside to take certain calls. I noticed he now placed his phone face down on every surface. I noticed Rosalind had stopped mentioning Fort Wayne entirely. One afternoon, Brandon left his jacket draped over the kitchen chair while he showered upstairs. His phone buzzed inside the pocket. I stared at it for nearly a full minute. I despised myself for even considering it. Then Nora started fussing in her swing beside me, and something about hearing my daughter cry while living inside this fog of deception pushed me past the edge. I pulled out the phone. The screen illuminated immediately. Tessa, Julian's game starts at 7. He keeps asking whether you're coming this time. My stomach plummeted. There was no explanation possible. No misunderstanding available. Just truth. Simple and ugly. I placed the phone back exactly where I found it moments before Brandon came downstairs. For the remainder of that evening I drifted through the house like a ghost. Brandon grilled frozen burgers for dinner while sleet fell outside. At one point he smiled at Nora sleeping in her bassinet and said, "She's starting to look more like me." I nearly laughed hard enough to choke. 2 days later, Yvette drove up from Columbus to meet me at a bakery cafe near the shopping center. I brought Nora in her carrier. Yvette brought legal pads and an expression that already looked exhausted on my behalf. She listened carefully while I explained the text message. Then she asked one question. "How much money do you currently have access to?" I blinked at her. "That's your first concern?" "That's my biggest concern." Turns out betrayal becomes intensely practical once attorneys enter the picture. Yvette explained that if Brandon had another family concealed somewhere, there was an excellent chance money had been concealed as well. He was right. Within a week, we discovered nearly $21,000 missing from our joint savings. Brandon called it temporary financial restructuring. Yvette called it preparation. I called it panic. Hiring a private investigator sounded theatrical when Yvette first suggested it. Like something from a television program elderly people watch while eating microwave dinners. But the reality was considerably less glamorous. The investigator was a weary former sheriff's deputy named Dale who met me inside a roadside diner off the interstate and billed by the hour. I sold my grandmother's gold locket to afford the retainer. That wounded me more than I anticipated. My grandmother raced me after my mother died. That locket was one of the very few objects I had left from her. I sat in my car outside the jewelry shop afterward and wept while Nora slept in the back seat. Not because of the money, but because I recognized my marriage had reached the point where I was selling family heirlooms to expose another family. Dale worked quickly though. Within 11 days he confirmed everything. Brandon had been making regular trips to Fort Wayne for years. Not business trips. Personal visits. Tessa Vance existed. So did Julian. There were hotel receipts, wire transfers, and a second phone line registered under Brandon's name. And Rosalind had mailed birthday packages to Fort Wayne nearly every single year. When Dale handed me the folder at a coffee shop across town, I actually felt nauseated. Not shocked anymore. Just tired. So profoundly tired. That same afternoon, Nora had a complete meltdown inside the supermarket while I was buying diapers and formula. The kind of public infant shriek that makes every shopper in a 50-foot radius turn and stare. I stood near the pharmacy aisle bouncing her awkwardly while fighting back my own tears. An older woman walked past and smiled sympathetically. "Long day?" she asked. I nearly laughed out loud. "Ma'am, you have absolutely no idea." By then I was barely sleeping. My body still ached. My marriage was disintegrating. And every fresh truth felt heavier than the last. There was one moment that nearly destroyed me completely. I was sitting in the driveway one evening after grocery shopping while Nora slept in her car seat. I had Dale's folder resting beside me. I had proof. Actual documented proof. And all I wanted in that moment was to walk inside, hand it back to Brandon, and beg him to explain everything in some way that somehow made sense. Not because I believed him anymore. Because part of me still mourned the version of him I had believed existed. I called Yvette, sobbing so hard I could barely form words. "I don't even know what I'm grieving anymore," I admitted. Yvette was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I never forgot. "Renee, missing who you thought he was is not the same thing as needing who he actually is." A week later I finally contacted Tessa. I expected fury. Instead I encountered exhaustion. We met at a diner outside Fort Wayne called Marlene's Kitchen. One of those places with faded pie posters and bottomless coffee refills. Tessa looked older than her online photographs. Not old exactly. Worn thin. Like someone who had spent years quietly carrying disappointment. Julian wasn't there. Thank God. I didn't believe a 15-year-old boy deserved front row seats to this catastrophe. Tessa wrapped both hands around a coffee mug while I explained what happened at the hospital. When I told her Brandon demanded a paternity test 25 minutes after Nora was born, she stared at me in genuine disbelief. Then she laughed once. A bitter little sound. "He accused me of cheating too," she said. I blinked. What? Years ago. Any time he felt guilty about something, suddenly I became the suspect. That sentence settled over the table like lead. Projection. That's what Yvette later called it. Brandon accused women of betrayal because he lived inside betrayal himself. Tessa finally laid out the full timeline. She met Brandon 16 years earlier at a trade convention in Indiana. Julian was born 15 years ago. Then Brandon married me 12 years ago while telling Tessa our relationship was essentially finished. Rosalind knew everything. Every birthday. Every payment. Every lie. At some point Tessa looked at me sadly and said, "He told me you were unstable." I surprised myself by laughing softly. "He told me I was unfaithful." For the first time all afternoon Tessa smiled a little too. Not because anything was funny but because we had both finally arrived at the same wretched truth. Brandon had constructed two women inside two separate lies. When I walked back to my car afterward, snow drifted lazily through the parking lot. Nora slept peacefully in the back seat. And sitting there on my phone was the lab email. I opened it with shaking hands. Probability of paternity, 99.9997%. Brandon was Nora's father. Of course he was. I had always known that. I sat there crying quietly while snow accumulated along the windshield. Not because I had lost him, but because I finally understood there had never been merely one betrayal. There had been hundreds. Small ones. Daily ones. Carefully administered ones. And somehow I had spent 12 years loving a man who treated truth as something optional. Before I left the diner parking lot, Tessa asked one final question through my lowered window. "What are you going to do now?" I looked at Nora sleeping behind me. Then I looked back at Tessa. And for the first time in weeks my voice sounded steady. "I'm going to make certain he never gets to call me crazy again." By the time June arrived, I had lost nearly 22 pounds without trying. Stress does that. So does surviving on reheated coffee and whatever you can eat one-handed while holding an infant. Ohio summers are miserable in a very particular way. Thick soupy air. Mosquitoes the size of raisins. Lawn mowers running non-stop from 8 in the morning. And somehow, despite my marriage collapsing in slow motion, the rest of the world continued behaving normally. Kids pedaled bikes through the neighborhood. People argued over mulch at the hardware store. The local news devoted 3 consecutive days to fireworks safety. Life simply kept moving. Rosalind insisted on hosting her annual Independence Day barbecue anyway. She called me personally the week before. "Renee," she said carefully, "families need moments to heal." I nearly laughed directly into the phone. That woman discussed healing the same way insurance companies discuss compassion. Very professionally. Not very honestly. So I agreed to attend. Not for Rosalind. Not for Brandon. For myself. Because Yvette had been right about one thing. If you let Brandon control the narrative, she told me, he'll rewrite your entire marriage before the divorce is finalized. And he had already begun trying. Apparently I was emotionally unstable following childbirth. Apparently I was overreacting. Apparently poor Brandon had simply asked reasonable questions. Funny how men like that always convert cruelty into concern the moment witnesses appear. The barbecue started around 4 in the afternoon. Rosalind's backyard looked identical to every other 4th of July I had spent there over the years. Plastic folding chairs. Cheap red, white, and blue tablecloths. Potato salad sweating in the heat. Classic rock playing softly through an aging Bluetooth speaker near the porch. Neighbors drifting in and out through the side gate carrying coolers and desserts. If you glanced quickly, it resembled a happy American family gathering. That was the strangest part. How ordinary betrayal can appear from the outside. Nora was almost 6 months old by then. I carried her against my shoulder while relatives clustered around pretending everything was normal. He's getting so big. She has Brandon's eyes. Such a blessing. I smiled politely while feeling like I was walking through a staged production. Brandon moved around the yard confidently all afternoon. That irritated me more than anger would have. He looked comfortable, relaxed, like a man convinced he had already survived the worst of it. At one point I watched him laughing beside the grill with his Uncle Vernon while holding Nora. For just a second I glimpsed the man I married again. The version who danced with me barefoot in our kitchen once when we were broke in 28. The version who held me after my second miscarriage and whispered that we would survive it together. That memory hit hard enough that I had to step away toward the patio, because grief becomes deeply confusing when the person who wounded you also gave you some of your happiest memories. Tessa arrived around 6:30. Quietly. No dramatic entrance. Just a silver sedan pulling up to the curb outside Rosalind's house. She came alone at first. Julian stayed in the car, because neither of us wanted him dragged into adult ugliness unless it became absolutely unavoidable. Tessa wore jeans, sandals, and a plain olive blouse. Nothing flashy. Nothing theatrical. She looked nervous. Honestly, so did I. Rosalind spotted her through the kitchen window and nearly dropped an entire tray of hamburger buns. That was the moment I knew she finally understood this was no longer fixable. Brandon hadn't noticed Tessa yet. He was far too busy performing. Around 7:30, after everyone had finished eating, Brandon stood up near the patio holding a beer bottle. Then he tapped a spoon lightly against the glass. That stupid little sound still lives in my head. Flick, flick, flick. Everyone quieted down. Rosalind had already gone pale. Brandon smiled tightly. "Well," he said, "I suppose we should finally clear up some rumors." I felt Nora shifting sleepily against my chest. Humidity clung to my skin. Fireworks cracked faintly somewhere in the distance. "The paternity results came back," Brandon announced. A few relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Then he smiled wider. "Nora is my daughter." Several people clapped politely. Not enthusiastically. More relieved than happy. And then Brandon made the single greatest mistake of his life. He looked directly at me and said, "And because I believe families deserve second chances, I'm willing to forgive Renee for all the stress the situation has caused." The yard went silent. I actually felt my heartbeat slow down rather than accelerate. Because suddenly every last trace of doubt evaporated. This man genuinely believed he was the victim. I stood carefully, adjusting Nora against my shoulder. Brandon, I said calmly, I'm glad you brought up forgiveness. His smile faltered slightly. Because before anyone here discusses forgiveness, I continued, they deserve the truth. Rosalind whispered sharply, Renee. I ignored her. Brandon gave a tired little chuckle as though I were embarrassing myself. Don't do this, he warned quietly. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said the truest thing I had felt in months. You accused me of adultery while I was still bleeding in a hospital bed. You don't get to decide what's uncomfortable anymore. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the children running around with sparklers seemed to fall quiet. I reached into my purse and withdrew my phone. Yvette had helped me organize everything meticulously beforehand. No screaming. No chaos. Just facts. I connected my phone to the outdoor television mounted near Rosalind's porch. The first image appeared on screen immediately. Nora's paternity results. Probability of paternity, 99.9997%. Brandon rolled his eyes instantly. We already know that. Yes, I said softly. Now let's move on to the part you forgot to mention. Next came the wire transfers. Hotel receipts. Phone records. Photographs of Brandon entering Tessa's apartment building in Fort Wayne. The silence in that backyard became suffocating. Uncle Vernon lowered his beer slowly. One of Rosalind's church friends actually whispered, "Oh my lord." Brandon stepped toward me fast. You went through my private records? I almost laughed. That was his concern. Privacy. Not the lying. Not the betrayal. Privacy. Tessa finally walked forward from near the side gate. Brandon froze when he saw her. Actually froze. For the first time all year I witnessed genuine fear cross his face. Tessa looked directly at him. Then she said quietly, "You told me your marriage ended years ago." Nobody spoke. Rosalind sat down heavily in one of the folding chairs like her knees had simply stopped functioning. Brandon recovered quickly though. Men like him usually do. "This is being twisted," he snapped. "Tessa's an old friend." Tessa stared at him in disbelief. "An old friend whose son calls you dad." That landed hard. You could physically feel the atmosphere shift in that yard afterward. Brandon looked around desperately searching for support. Most people avoided eye contact entirely. Except Rosalind. He was crying openly now. "Roz," Uncle Vernon asked slowly, "you knew about this?" Rosalind covered her mouth with trembling fingers. "I was trying to keep the family together." I finally looked directly at her. "No," I said quietly. "You were helping him manage two families." Brandon pointed toward me suddenly. "She's emotional. She just had a baby." Tessa barked out one harsh laugh. "That's exactly what you told me about her." And there was the pattern. Same manipulation, different woman. Brandon realized far too late that his own lies matched too perfectly. One of his cousins muttered under his breath. Brandon's face began flushing red. "You're ruining everything," he snapped at me. I shook my head slowly. "No, Brandon. I simply stopped protecting it." Then I handed him the divorce papers. Actual physical papers. Yvette had insisted on that detail. "Sometimes reality needs weight," she had said. Brandon stared at them without touching them. Around us, fireworks burst somewhere beyond the neighborhood treeline. Small flashes of crimson and gold reflected across the television screen. Nobody looked festive anymore. Nobody looked comfortable. Good. For once the discomfort belonged entirely to him. As I turned toward the driveway carrying Nora, Brandon called after me. "You're going to regret this." I stopped beside the gate. Then I looked back at the man who had spent months trying to make me question my own sanity. "The only thing I regret," I said, "is not recognizing sooner that your accusation was actually a confession." Then I left. No dramatic music. No applause. Just humid Ohio air and fireworks exploding over somebody else's celebration while I buckled my daughter into her car seat with shaking hands. Driving away from Rosalind's house, I expected triumph. What I felt instead was exhaustion. Relief too, but mostly exhaustion. Because revenge sounds glamorous when people discuss it online. In actual life, it feels like paperwork, panic attacks, and struggling not to cry at red lights while your baby sleeps in the backseat. 6 months after the 4th of July barbecue, Nora and I lived in a 2-bedroom townhouse in Perrysburg with beige carpeting, paper-thin walls. and a kitchen so cramped I could open the refrigerator or the dishwasher but never both simultaneously. Honestly, I hated it initially. Not because it was ugly but because it represented failure in my mind. At 38, I believed I had already constructed my permanent life. Then suddenly I was unpacking paper plates while my daughter napped beside moving boxes. The first night there, I sat on the living room floor eating microwave macaroni while Nora slept in a second-hand bassinet beside me. Outside, somebody's dog barked without pause. The upstairs neighbor walked like he was wearing steel-toed boots indoors. And I cried harder than I had the day I left Brandon. Because leaving isn't the difficult part. Living afterward is. Divorce transforms life into logistics. Lawyers, custody calendars, health insurance, utility transfers. You stop feeling like a person sometimes and start feeling like a filing cabinet. Brandon fought harder during the divorce than I anticipated. Not emotionally. Strategically. Yvette explained it to me one afternoon while we sat in her office drinking scorched coffee. He's not attempting to save the marriage, she said. He's attempting to save the version of himself that existed before people found out. He was correct. Brandon suddenly became profoundly invested in fatherhood publicly. He posted photographs with Nora online, started attending church regularly again, told people he was working through difficult family circumstances. Funny how certain men discover emotional depth once witnesses become involved. Privately, though, he was furious. Any boundary I established became evidence I was vindictive. When I insisted all communication route through a co-parenting application, he called me cold. When I refused surprise visits, he called me controlling. When I asked him not to criticize me in front of Nora, he accused me of weaponizing our child. Yvette once looked at me across her desk and said, "Some people confuse losing control with being mistreated." That sentence carried me through an enormous amount. Financially, things tightened rapidly. I returned to work part-time at the high school sooner than I wanted because daycare costs were brutal. Every morning became a military operation. Pack bottles. Pack diapers. Locate clean clothing. Attempt to recall whether I had brushed my own teeth. Some days I arrived at work feeling like I had already completed a full shift before 8:30 in the morning. The hardest part surprised me though. Loneliness. Not romantic loneliness. Just ordinary human loneliness. There's something peculiar about becoming a single mother at nearly 40. Most people your age constructed stable routines years earlier. Their children are older. Their marriages either survived or concluded long ago. Meanwhile, I was showing up to pediatric appointments alone, hauling diaper bags and pretending I wasn't frightened constantly. Some nights after Nora finally fell asleep, I would sit on the couch in complete silence just staring at nothing. Too exhausted to watch television. Too restless to sleep. That's when the grief usually arrived. Not grief for Brandon exactly. Grief for the life I believed I had. Therapy helped eventually. I hated hearing that sentence whenever people said it to me, but it's true. My therapist's office smelled like peppermint tea and old paperbacks. She wore heavy cardigans and never rushed me. One afternoon I admitted something aloud for the first time. "I exposed him," I said, "but somehow I still feel like I lost." She nodded gently. Because healing and winning aren't the same thing. That irritated me initially. I wanted victory. Something clean and satisfying. But recovery isn't cinematic. Some days it simply means managing to shower before noon. Rosalind started writing letters around September. Actual handwritten letters. The first several were mostly excuses. I was trying to protect the family. "I never intended to hurt you. Brandon has always struggled emotionally." That last one nearly made me laugh. As though emotional struggle accidentally produces 15-year secret children. I ignored her for weeks. Then one afternoon I opened a letter while Nora played on the carpet beside me, gnawing on a rubber giraffe. This one was different. Shorter. No excuses. Just one sentence that actually mattered. "I should have told you the truth years ago." That was the first honest thing Rosalind had ever given me. Eventually I agreed to supervised visits with Nora. Not because Rosalind had earned forgiveness. Because Nora deserved the opportunity to know people honestly, provided they were willing to behave honestly. That became my governing rule going forward. No more relationships constructed around pretending. Around Thanksgiving, Tessa called unexpectedly. I almost didn't answer. But I did. We met for coffee halfway between our two cities at a highway restaurant off the interstate. Very glamorous. Tessa looked less tense this time. Still tired but somehow lighter. Julian had started high school football. Apparently he was terrible at algebra and obsessed with buffalo wings. For the first time he sounded like an ordinary teenage boy rather than evidence in a scandal. Tessa stirred cream into her coffee quietly. "You know," she admitted, "for years I thought you were the problem." I nodded slowly. "He told me you were unstable." She gave a dry little laugh. "He told me you were cold." That nearly made me smile. Imagine being described as cold by a man who demanded a paternity test beside a newborn bassinet. We sat quietly for a minute. Then Tessa looked at me carefully. "Do you hate me?" It was such an honest question that I answered honestly too. "No," I said. "I think we both trusted the same liar." We never became close friends after that. Life isn't a film. But we stopped regarding each other as enemies. That mattered. A few weeks before Christmas, I mailed Julian a small envelope. Inside were old college photographs of Brandon from before everything became complicated. Grinning beside shabby apartments, holding fishing rods, standing at football games with terrible hair. I included a brief note. "You deserved honesty from the adults around you long before now." I never told Brandon about that package. Some things belonged to the children left cleaning up the wreckage. By winter the divorce was finally finalized. No dramatic courtroom speeches. No grand emotional conclusion. Just signatures, paperwork, final figures. The strange quiet that settles once chaos finally burns itself out. One evening in February, I sat near the townhouse window watching snow fall while Nora slept upstairs. The entire neighborhood looked soft and peaceful beneath the streetlights. And for the first time in nearly a year, I recognized that I was no longer waiting for disaster. That feeling alone was worth everything. People hear stories like mine and assume revenge is about destroying someone. Honestly, it isn't. Not real revenge. Real revenge is refusing to allow someone else to define your worth after they attempted to break it. It's rebuilding a peaceful life even when starting over embarrasses you. It's learning that being alone feels considerably safer than being lied to every single day. And perhaps most importantly, it's understanding that survival doesn't always look impressive while you're living through it. Sometimes survival looks like second-hand furniture, therapy appointments, and crying quietly in grocery store parking lots before driving home to feed your baby. But it still counts. If you've ever had to rebuild your life after betrayal, I hope you remember this. Starting over later in life is not failure. Sometimes it's the first honest decision you've made in years. And if this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts below. Somebody out there may be sitting in their own parked car tonight, wondering whether they're strong enough to begin again.